The scene appeared unremarkable at first glance. A former central banker, measured in his remarks, discussed trade incentives and the importance of credibility. There were no raised voices, no catchphrases, no dramatic gestures. Yet in that moment, something essential was revealed. Mark Carney didn't simply critique a tariff or argue over a percentage. He laid bare the underlying belief that sustained the entire Trump trade conflict. Once recognized, the approach ceased to appear forceful and instead seemed precarious. The premise was straightforward, almost elegantly blunt, that sufficient pressure inevitably compels compliance. Allies may complain, markets may fluctuate, executives may object, but ultimately, all would yield. This is the mindset of bilateral bargaining, not systemic thinking, of transactional deals, not enduring institutions, of power measured by immediate response, not by gradual adaptation. For a time, this seemed credible. Markets reacted, headlines proliferated, negotiators shuttled to and from Washington. On the surface, there was movement, but Carney addressed what occurs beneath that activity. He spoke of how institutions absorb shocks, how capital finds new ground, how governments hedge rather than capitulate. In doing so, he exposed the recurring flaw in Trump's use of economic might, mistaking visibility for actual control. Trade wars seem potent because they are noisy. Tariffs make themselves known. They provoke retaliatory measures and heated press briefings. They generate dramatic graphs. But true leverage in a modern economy is not found in spectacle. It lies in expectations about order, reliability, and consistency. Carney, with years inside the machinery of global finance, grasps what many politicians overlook. Markets don't react to threats as voters do. They don't remain alarmed indefinitely. They reposition. Trump's implicit and at times explicit belief was that the U.S. could inflict pain more rapidly than others could adjust, that the vastness of the American market would outweigh the endurance of trading partners, that this imbalance would ensure obedience. In limited scenarios, this logic holds, but Carney's argument was that the global system is no longer designed for isolated cases. It is structured for resilience. When tariffs increase, supply chains don't argue, they relocate. When uncertainty rises, capital doesn't object, it recalculates risk and moves. When trust erodes, institutions don't collapse, they quietly limit their exposure. None of this is visible on television. None of it is dramatic in the short run, but over time, it accumulates. Carney wasn't making a moral case or defending free trade as a principle. He was outlining a practical reality. When the world learns that access to the U.S. market is subject to political whims, the logical reaction is diversification, not defiance, not surrender, but diversification. This response undermines the very leverage tariffs are meant to create. Here, the critical flaw becomes clear. Trump's trade policy treated global commerce as a series of confrontations, each solvable by intensifying pressure. Carney saw it as a network where stress on one part redistributes strain throughout. In a confrontation, the larger party prevails. In a network, the inflexible party loses adaptability. The troubling aspect isn't that tariffs failed to achieve their stated goals, it's that they succeeded in teaching institutions how to function without depending on American favor. That lesson persists beyond any policy change. It becomes ingrained. This is why Carney's intervention was significant. He wasn't debating ideology, he was identifying a systemic flaw. When you use access to the heart of the global economy as a weapon, you don't just extract concessions, you encourage others to develop alternatives. Trump believed pressure would consolidate power. Carney explained why it disperses it. Once this is understood, the trade war no longer appears as a display of strength, but as an unintended guide on how to lessen U.S. centrality without losing a single negotiation. Carney's real contribution was to place Trump's trade war within a much older institutional narrative, one that predates any administration and operates mostly out of public view. To grasp why the strategy faltered, one must look beyond personalities and examine how the post-war economic order was built to respond to stress. After World War II, the U.S. didn't just create markets, it established expectations. The Bretton Woods system, the dollar-centric financial order, and later the WTO, were not tools of constant coercion, they were engines of credibility. The system's strength came from the belief that rules would be dull, predictable, and impartially enforced. This stability enabled capital to grow, supply chains to expand, and allies to commit to U.S.-led frameworks without fearing abrupt changes. Carney, having worked at the core of this system, recognizes a vital asymmetry. Institutions are slow to form, but adapt rapidly when their foundational beliefs are threatened. Trump's trade war clashed directly with this asymmetry. By treating trade ties as temporary deals rather than lasting commitments, his administration challenged not just individual partners, but the very logic of institutional trust. Here, history is crucial. The global economy is no longer a hub-and-spoke model, with Washington at the center dictating terms. It is a complex web of overlapping agreements, currency arrangements, regional trade blocs, and regulatory alignments. Power doesn't vanish in such a system, it spreads out. When pressure is applied unilaterally, the system's instinct is not to confront, but to insulate. Carney's insight was that Trump misunderstood how allies perceive risk. Canada, the EU, Japan, and even segments of U.S. business don't view tariffs as bargaining chips. They see them as warnings that access can be revoked at any time, that political cycles override technical agreements. Once these signals are sent, institutions respond rationally. They reduce reliance. This explains why the trade war prompted so many quiet technical adjustments rather than loud political clashes. Central banks changed reserve policies, companies rewrote contracts, governments sped up trade negotiations elsewhere. None of this required public defiance, just spreadsheets. Trump's approach assumed a world still governed by Cold War logic, where pain led directly to political surrender. Carney pointed to a post-Cold War reality. Pain is often less costly than unpredictability. A tariff is a known expense. An unreliable partner is an open-ended risk. Ironically, the sheer size of the U.S. economy, which Trump used as a blunt tool, was historically effective because it wasn't used bluntly. U.S. centrality worked because it was the safest, most predictable option. Institutions gravitated towards the U.S. because it reduced transaction costs, stabilized expectations, and separated politics from process. The trade war blurred that separation. Carney's analysis also clarified why the backlash was muted. Institutions don't protest, they hedge. They don't announce departures, they quietly build alternatives. The response to Trump's trade policy was not resistance, but reconfiguration. This leads to a deeper issue. Trump saw trade as a zero-sum game between nations. Carney saw it as a credibility-based system, where long-term positioning outweighs short-term victories. One view rewards escalation, the other punishes it over time. This tension between episodic and structural power is the fault line of the trade war. The next chapter isn't about Trump's intentions, but who believed the strategy would work and why that belief lasted longer than evidence supported. The core error of Trump's trade war wasn't impulsiveness, but a confidence, shared by many, that modern institutions would react like older ones under pressure. That belief was rooted in decades of U.S. success in shaping systems without breaking them. That history made the mistake persistent. In Washington, the logic seemed inassailable. The U.S. market was essential, the dollar supreme. American consumers absorbed global output. If tariffs caused pain, it would be felt unevenly. Dependent partners would negotiate. This wasn't ideological, but transactional. Many experienced officials, business leaders, and foreign counterparts initially thought it would work because it had before. But those earlier successes happened in a different context: shallower supply chains, less mobile capital, weaker alternative markets, and crucially, unquestioned U.S. credibility. Trump's team assumed that context still existed. Carney revealed it did not. The mistake wasn't just overestimating U.S. leverage, but misunderstanding dependence. Trump saw dependence as fixed. You either rely on the U.S. or you don't. Carney saw it as fluid. Reliance is always being renegotiated based on risk. Tariffs, instead of increasing dependence, exposed it as a liability. What's remarkable is how long this era lasted despite growing evidence. Tariffs didn't devastate foreign economies, didn't win sweeping concessions, didn't force allies into line, yet the strategy intensified. Why? Because the feedback was misleading. Markets didn't crash, GDP didn't plummet, there was no dramatic failure. Instead, trust eroded slowly, something political systems struggle to measure. Trump's approach also fell into a psychological trap. Escalation feels like action, de-escalation like retreat. When talks stalled, the instinct was to apply more pressure, not reconsider assumptions. Each new tariff became proof of resolve, not a test of strategy. The lack of immediate disaster was mistaken for success. Carney's critique cut through this illusion. He noted that institutions don't react to pressure like political opponents. They don't internalize threats emotionally, they calculate them. Once priced in, threats lose their force. A tariff becomes just another cost. An unreliable partner becomes a strategic risk. Here, belief outpaced reality. Trump's circle thought the system had no choice but to yield. Carney showed it always has another option, it just doesn't announce it. Firms diversify suppliers, governments deepen regional ties, financial institutions hedge currency risk. None of this looks like defiance, but together it neutralizes leverage. The deeper error was thinking power could be used repeatedly without diminishing returns. Trump saw tariffs as reusable tools. Carney saw them as signals with cumulative effects. The first gets attention, the